All right, welcome back, everybody. Now we have our Antitrust Roundtable. We have heard three really good papers comparing and contrasting the situation in the United States and China regarding the competition policy implications of the major platforms. And now we're going to have more of an open-ended discussion. I want to emphasize that we're going to sort of pose some questions to the panelists and have each of them respond maybe for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we will go on to the next question. So why don't, Yik, why don't you start with the first questions?
Thank you very much for joining us, all of the panelists. Ask the first question in Chinese because we have some Chinese panelists. And so, 因为我们有2位就是从中国来的那个讲者。所以我想第一个问题，我就代表中方提出第一个问题，用中文问。那就是我想问一下，就是我们刚才也听了，就是各位也听了3位不同的讲者对于就是垄断或者是我们讲的反垄断法的一些规则的一些讨论。我想问一下大家觉得，就是说数字平台到底对传统的垄断的一些理论带来什么样的挑战？就是我们讲的很多各种各样的怎么样判断一个是不是垄断行为，或者是不是一个市场的一个 abuse 的行为，都有一些传统的理论。那数字平台到底对这些传统的理论带来什么样的挑战呢？谢谢各位。
Are you going to ask it in English also?
Yeah, okay, yeah. And my question is that we have already listened to the 3 speakers' analysis of the antitrust regulation or different theories, you know, the traditional one or the new theories. So I just want to know whether there's any new challenge brought by the digital platform to those kind of the theories in both the US context or in the Chinese context. What kind of the challenge brought to the traditional theories in terms of the determination of the antitrust and the antitrust policy and regulation? Thank you.
Okay, so we'll start with Paul, then we'll go in the order that they're listed on the roundtable. Let's go to Paul, Jet, Xingdong, and Neil.
Sure, thanks, Milton. And you know, I'm coming at this from less an academic point of view than sort of a business. We have a lot of clients that you know, that use these platforms in China as you know, for their services, and you know, are very involved in and also involved in investing in them. So when we look at this sort of antitrust growth in antitrust, you know, we're in China. I think particularly it's important to distinguish between sort of the political side of the equation and sort of the regulatory side. So I think, as you may have discussed before, and I apologize for missing it, there were long-standing issues around platform, sort of non-regulation of platforms that led to things like the, you know, choose one from two policies, where consumers were being increasingly asked to sort of choose between, for example, the Tencent and Alibaba platform, and those were building for a long time. And then you know, the sense in the regulatory side of the house in China that these companies were getting into all sorts of other business lines outside of sort of the more traditional areas where they'd been in, around payments, for example, getting into other areas of finance. So the regulatory system was sort of poised, I think, last year, for example, to change the equation. Now you overlay that with Jack Ma getting up in Shanghai and sort of dissing the regulators. This apparently went all the way up to Liu He, Vice Premier Liu He, and up to Xi Jinping. And so the ant issue is almost, I don't want, and sort of the prominence of sort of platform founders like Jack Ma is almost a separate issue. But I think it also plays into the regulatory side, in the sense that, you know, those issues kind of came together and then led to this very big regulatory sort of churn that we've seen over the last 6 months that have engulfed Ant and Alibaba, of course, with the big fines. And then also just recently with the Didi IPO in New York coming up, have led to sort of more scrutiny of the sort of business practices of Didi and some of the other platforms. So I think it's not surprising that we got here. I mean, the regulatory system was eventually going to sort of catch up with some of these practices, and so there was sort of a need to regularize the system. The question is, the political overlay also includes sort of the U.S.-China context, where I think Chinese authorities are eager to not undermine too much the business models of some of these platforms, because they're going to be at some point competing, or already are competing, with some of the big U.S. players globally, for example, and that's going to be a big issue coming up. Is how Chinese platforms will be regulated outside of China in a context of data governance in Europe and other places. How they'll be treated because of their some view of their close association with the Chinese government and the ability to, for example, if the Chinese government ask for data. So that's going to be a big issue coming up. So I think the regulatory space is not surprising. We're here in a big way. And I think going forward, it's going to get more complicated. But I think the issue is complicated because it's not just regulatory, but there's a lot of political issues around the founders and then around sort of the broader U.S.-China competition.
Excellent, thank you. Jet, why don't you intervene here and basically respond to the same question?
OK， 实际上其实这个问题10年前就很多人讨论了，一直说说现在这个数字经济平台跟传统行业在反垄断监管上面有什么不一样的？其实从我在中国职业这么多的经验来看，以及跟这个国外同行交流。其实我并不认为说这个平台这个所谓的这个反垄断监管跟传统行业有什么本质的区别。你比如说我们谈了很多的一些特点，像这个数据这一块，平台掌握很多的数据，但其实这个数据其实从很早以前就存在于这个各个行业之中。我们也谈到它是一个双边的或者是一个多边的市场，但双边市场并不是说数字经济或者并不是这么一个互联网平台的一个发明。那么它其实一早就存在于这个各类的这个传统的这个行业跟市场之中。我们也谈到这个平台它有跨行业它可能会做不同的做不同的产品和服务，但是这个跨行业跟跨服务的这种形式其实也太早就存在。那只是说这些数字平台，那么它在一个指数级别上，它这个加强了它的这些特征。那其实说反映在我们这个反垄断这个监管的在技术层面，你比如说它会对这个相关市场界定以及说市场力量的这么一个认定，那么会产生一些影响。同样，它对这个横向垄断协议包括卡特，那么比如说现在这个人工智能 AI。那么它会使得它的这种达人卡特的形式会发生一些变化。所以其实从我来讲，作为一个中国职业律师角度来讲，我觉得这个数字平台来讲跟其他传统行业并没有说本质的区别，但是它在现代，那么对于这些互联网数字在这种技术层面会加大它一个复杂性。那么这个其实我想会需要我们在一些反垄断监管的技术层面会做一些调整，但是其实并不会影响到它的整体的一个法律的一个监管的框架的。好，谢谢。
Okay, good. So you're taking the traditional line that this is traditional antitrust principles should apply.
Yeah. Yes. I think that's it.
Xingdong Fang. 2 or 3 minutes.
这个我大概可以换个角度，因为我在高科技领域里面反垄断大概有超过20年，然后呼吁互联网反垄断大概也有10年，这2选1占到了6年。我觉得从一个我亲历者角度来看，我觉得在这个理论和实践面前，我觉得还是实践推动了这个理论，是吧？我觉得这次反垄断它并不是说这个理论的问题。因为理论的问题，不管是过去的反垄断法、反不正当竞争法，我觉得法律方面都是基本上都是可以用的，那可能中国和欧洲、美国可能最大的不同就是说，中国在反垄断方面，它并不存在一个非常强大的独立的一个学术共同体，所以在过去的10年里头，就是基本上中国的活跃的这个反垄断的这个学者基本上都可以拿到这个。腾讯阿里百度就是 BAT 的这个很多这个课题，所以他们这3家互联网垄断者，在过去的这个10年里头，就是尤其是最近的5年里头，他们3家在每年在互联网垄断方面的这个学术界的投入，大概应该每年超过这个1000万美金级，所以基本上就是说，在过去的这个5年里头，就是没有真正的针对这个互联网垄断真正有理论上的突破，或者有在学术上能发出声音来甚至在媒体上这个发出声音来所以它还是一个，就是我觉得反垄断它还是因为 这个整个这个反垄断的影响，尤其是这个社会政治文化的这个影响积累到一定程度以后，这个政府高层觉得有必要是吧？这个要反垄断是吧？然后开始了这个市场运动，然后理论界才开始了这个关注起来是吧？所以我觉得当然就是我觉得现在的局面不一样了，就是说这个原来的很多事情大概是一路，比如你要讲反垄断，那就一路红灯啊，这个学术论文也很难发，这个媒体也很难发声啊。现在就开始一路绿灯啊，然后或是就今天的会议，我就看到这么多年轻的这个学者，我就开始这个崛起，是吧？我觉得接下来可能中国的互联网的这个理论研究，我觉得也会快速的这个崛起。那我觉得最终还是要有一个很强大的这个学术共同体，我觉得这个反垄断才能进入到一个比较理性的、比较健康的一个状态啊。我觉得中国还是在这个道路上。
Okay, I think you mentioned an acronym, AML. I don't think many people know what you meant by that. Can you just what is AML?
您解释一下什么是 AML？
Okay.
Okay. Actually,
Okay.
AML.
And now let's move
Actually,
on
it
to
stands
Neil
for
Chilson.
Anti-monopoly law.
Thanks. Very interesting question, and thanks for having me on this panel. When I think about the challenges that modern digital platforms place on antitrust law, I kind of would separate them out into two big categories. One is the sort of societal, political challenges, and I'll set those aside for a second. But the bigger ones are the more immediate ones are around the analysis that we bring to traditional antitrust analysis to this. And the big questions that platforms raise are largely economic ones and primarily focused around how do you define a market in these spaces. And that's in part because we've heard the terms network effects. To dig into that a little bit, one thing that's different about, say, some of these platforms compared to, say, telecommunications networks, where the network effect was generally appreciated on one side. So the more people who joined a telecom network, the more useful it was to each person who joined. That type of network effect. Platforms have indirect network effects where by having more people on one side of the platform, say on the merchant side, for example, on the Amazon platform, the benefits to the consumers are higher. And as you have more consumers on the platform, the benefits to the merchants are higher. So those types of network effects are interesting, and they raise a bunch of questions for how we should think about what is a market in antitrust analysis. There's been lots of questions about how we might examine that, but the courts have already dug into this quite a lot, and all the way up to the Supreme Court in a recent case, Ohio versus American Express, which looked expressly at a two-sided platform and said, how do we think about market definition in this space? That was a case that involved American Express having these restrictions on whether or not merchants could steer, these are called anti-steering provisions, could steer consumers away from using American Express because the fees were higher and use something else to pay for the in-store purchases that they were making. The Supreme Court said that in order to evaluate this, we have to think of the whole transaction. So the whole platform is the market, not just the interaction between American Express and the merchants, but also the interaction between American Express and the consumers, and that we had to weigh the benefits across that whole market and evaluate the competitive effects across that whole market rather than just the effects on between the merchant and the card provider. Now they were careful to say that they were only really opining on that application for payment systems where a single transaction occurred immediately. But I think there's a lot of lessons there, and I think a very similar analysis could apply to many of the digital platforms. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in many of the cases that Sarah walk through that are happening. On the more political or societal impacts, I would say these are not only big companies, they're big, but there's lots of big companies out there. these are companies that consumers interact with daily. And so they are interested in how these companies work. And that brings a sort of political dimension to this that I think people in the antitrust world are grappling with. People are looking for tools to appease various political constituents, and antitrust is one of the tools out there. And so they're thinking about how they might use antitrust. And that's led to some people looking at antitrust and saying that it's the wrong tool to do these sorts of things, and maybe we should move to more sector-specific regulation. It's also led to people looking at antitrust and saying, well, it doesn't work in this case, so we should change antitrust. And that's you know, and that would change antitrust presumably beyond the platform market. So I think those are really interesting issues. The one third component that falls in that society side is that a lot of these platforms, especially more on the social media side, they have a big effect on some of their competitors in the media space. And so because the primary avenues of revenue from these companies, from Google and Facebook, for example, are advertising, they compete in many ways with traditional news media, who also sells advertising. And I don't think people talk enough about that, but it does mean that there are some very interested, quite influential competitors in this space who are also creating pressure to do something about these platforms, perhaps using antitrust law. And we've seen legislative examples around that, but there's lots of other things we can get into. But I'll stop there.
Yes, you raised quite a few very profound issues. Number one, the sort of media conflict of interest. Number two, the legal precedents in the American Express case, the question of direct or indirect network externalities and so on. What we wanted to go to next was kind of a contrast between the American and Chinese approaches. And I think some people may be afraid to say it directly, but I'm not. So Americans have the view that maybe the Chinese, and this was raised by Kareem's question, it's sort of like, are they really applying standard independent antitrust analysis, or is it more political? But that may not be a fair comparison of the two. It seems like, based on He Qing's presentation, that there's a very elaborate traditional form of antitrust analysis going on in China. But at the same time, we don't see the same kind of court precedents because it's much newer in China. So what would you say are the similarities and differences between the Chinese and the American approaches? And what implications do you think those have? We'll go through the same order. So Paul and then
yeah, it's a great question. I think, you know, in China, of course, what's really happened is you've had a sort of market regulator, SAMR in this case, the State Administration for Market Regulation, sort of take the lead. For example, recently in all these cases involving the big platforms, and they brought in other sectoral regulators like the People's Bank of China and other things, because some of these issues, of course, of regulation cut across a lot of areas. So I don't think there's been such a sort of reliance on legal, on like the anti-monopoly law and sort of calling those, you know, using sort of a more formalized legal structure to sort of start moving the ball. There was a lot of, I think, just political pressure. Hey, we got to do something about these platforms. You know, and again, the Jack Ma sort of made this such a huge sort of political headline kind of case. So there was this flurry of sort of unprecedented regulatory activity that was led by, in particular, SAMR, which had its headcount beefed up, et cetera, et cetera. In the U.S., you know, it's been a really long-standing debate about how to regulate these platforms. I think the preference in the U.S. though is to sort of, you know, use the FTC's authorities and then also put in place legislation. So we've seen this huge increase. The House Antitrust Subcommittee, you know, put forward all these bills on antitrust, targeting in many cases, you know, many of our clients, and looking at specific pieces of the sort of antitrust landscape. The American Innovation and Choice Online Act, that would make it illegal for companies that run designated platforms to privilege their own businesses. So a lot of the issues that that Neil raised. I mean, the idea that something needs to be done about these competitive practices and things like the use of data. And so I think the U.S. system, as it is, will probably end up wanting to sort of push the debate via legislation and come up with something that it'll be messy. It'll be there won't be. In China, it was sort of okay, we have to do this, and so the regulator sort of jumped in and started the regulatory process in earnest. But I think in the U.S. it's going to be a long, agonizing debate about all these different bills, and in particular the ones that were just proposed over the last month even, and around sort of how to what pieces of the regulatory pie and on the antitrust side should be sort of emphasized first, and which others maybe can wait. It's going to be a tricky political debate because the Republicans, of course, will be pushing for sort of less less regulation, and then I think we have Lina Khan, who's the new person on the FTC, and there'll be sort of another whole debate around her role and how to push some of these antitrust measures, and then I think there's already been a few moves at the state level in the U.S. also, so there'll have to be some involvement of state authorities who already have cases against Google and Facebook and some of the big players. So there's going to be a huge sort of political churn in the U.S. around this issue. And then the overlay there also is that and some of the companies have pushed back and said, well, we need to be able to compete with Chinese platforms, and so we don't want to be overregulated because there's a sort of a global geopolitical issue around platform competition. So I think there's less, of course, debate about that in China. I think a lot of the concerns center on the consumer issues that Neil mentioned about like forcing consumers to choose and being more transparent about pricing around some of the platforms, around things like payments and e-commerce. But in the U.S., I think it's a more philosophical view about how do we get regulation, and of course last year it became hugely politicized with the suspending of various political figures' use of things like Facebook and Twitter. So it's become sort of it's in the political space, and it's very charged on, and people have strong views on either side.
Jet, same to you.
OK， 其实这是一个很有趣的话题，我想这可能也是今天我们讨论的一个讨论一个核心一个焦点。其实我观察3个司法区，那么中国、美国和欧盟，那么在对于这个互联网的执法，大概在过去的10几年中，很有意思，就是中国和美国其实一直都很不活跃，那么欧盟一直很活跃虽然当然是欧盟它主要监管的都是美国的企业了，那么但是突然之间，这个美国和中国从去年开始，突然变得都很活跃了，我一直在观察，其实在思考，那么中美两国之间，那么在用反垄断法，那么去规制这些大类互联网平台的一些相同和差异的地方。我想从四个角度去谈一下我自己的一些观察。我想首先是还是在这个经济层面。那么在经济层面，其实毫无疑问，那么不管是在美国还是在中国，那么这些大的平台的崛起，那么不管是在电商，还是在这个社交或者是在这个我们说日常的打车或者用餐，那么这些互联网平台都已经极大的那么占据了这我们市场的一个很实质的一个部分。那么他们的崛起，一方面带来了这个技术的这个革新，那另一方面其实也对一些这个中小企业对一些市场活跃度会产生的这个负面影响。当然这里面会有一个很有意思的地方，就是说，那当然这里面还有一个，我们看到美国也好，中国也好，其实互联网的这个平台其实都是这个私营企业，在中国我们更多讲民营企业，但是呢，两国的这个经济主体的这个构成是不一样的。我知道美国的主体可能它就是私营企业，但中国的主体其实是这个国有经济。但在中国，我们的所有的互联网平台，大的平台做得好的，那么全部是这个私营企业。那所以现在，那么两国来用反垄断法来规制这个互联网平台，其实规制的都是这个大的私营的那么这些互联网平台。那么这个是第一个角度，这个我们从这个经济的角度 那么第二个角度，其实我讲这个就关于这个政治，其实今天很多嘉宾都谈了这个话题，其实大家好像都对这个很感兴趣。当然，其实我想我们其实都应该承认，在世界各国，在欧洲也好，在美国也好，在中国也好，或者在其他国家也好，反垄断跟政治的关系都是非常紧密的。那么其实可能是在所有的法律的这个领域里面，这个反垄断是政治对它影响最大的一个领域。这一点在各国都没有例外。那只是说，那么这个政治或者说政府，那么对于反垄断监管的这个影响，那么它会在美国和中国，它的程度上可能会有一些差异，但是实质上其实并没有差异的。美国的共和党和民主党，他们对反垄断的这个司法态度，不同的总统是存在极大的差异的。那么在中国，当然中国不一样，中国我们没有说没有两党的这个轮转，我们只有说中国共产党它的一党的这个执政。所以说它在中国来讲，那么政治对于反垄断监管的这个影响会更加的这个直接，会更加的这个聚焦一些。我想这个是一个这个是从政治角度去看的这个中美两国的一个差异。那么第三个角度是我说这个舆论，或者是说这个媒体，或者叫它这个民意也好。那实际上其实我是看到这几年以来，那么其实在国际上或者在中国的国内，那么特别是在中国的国内，那么这种公众对于这个互联网平台的态度有一个明显的一个转变。那么之前大家都比较大家其实都是比较愉快的，因为看到互联网平台那么给大家生活便利所带来的这么一种帮助，那么是给这个创新那么带来一种积极的变化。但是随着这个时间的推移，大家也看到，那么这些平台的发展已经是很大程度上它去干涉到了我们个人的生活，它掌握的数据，那么已经是使得这些平台拿到了很多我们这个市场主体也好，特别是个人的很多隐私的这个数据。那么它其实对于我们个人的个人生活以及我们包括一些我们这个消费行为的影响，已经是在产生它负面的一个作用了。那么这个因为有这种舆论的这个态度的转变，那么这个会对中国在反垄断加强对于互联网平台这个方面监管这块，那么会起到一个这个推进的作用。那么这个是第三个角度。那么第四个角度，因为我是律师，所以想谈一下这个法律的角度。如果我们去读中国的反垄断法，然后你再读一下美国的反垄断法，美国希尔曼法也好，FTC 法也好，或者别法，这个在实体上，中国的反垄断法跟美国的反垄断法是没有区别的，他们在实体上两国的法律是一样的，唯一的区别是中国的法律专门有一个章节是关于这个规制这个行政垄断，但这个是它主要是针对于政府滥用行政权力去干预市场竞争的这么一种行为，因为这个是在中国，因为我们这个在政府还在很大程度上会对市场经济会有干预，所以我们的法律对此要有规制。但是除此之外，两国的这个反垄断法在实体上并没有任何的区别。那么区别在哪里？那么从法律上来看，这个区别不在于这个法律的实体，在于法律的这个程序。你比如说执法机构，那么美国有2家DOJ 和 FTC， 那么中国我们只有1家，叫国家市场监管总局，英文叫这个SAMA。然后我们看这个人员的配置，那么 DOJ 跟 FTC 他们在执法人员上面，他们可能有数千名的这个人员，超过几千人。在中国，我们的国家市场监管总局，我们的SAMA只有40多人的。那么这个是一个极大的一个差异。另外，我们知道，在美国 DOJ 和 FTC 他们并不能够直接去对这个不管是亚马逊还是说 Facebook 去做罚款，他们只能在联邦法院提起诉讼。但在中国，根据中国的行政处罚法，我们的国家市场监管总局是可以直接对平台企业进行调查和进行罚款的，并不需要借助于法院诉讼它来进行。然后，因为在中国来讲，我们对于平台的这个反垄断监管，它必须要遵循我们中国的这个行政处罚法。那么在成员法上，这个中美两国是有很大的差异的。我举个例子来讲，那么比如说，那么国家市场监管总局，那么它对阿里巴巴去进行这个处罚，在正式的处罚决定之前，他会给阿里巴巴发一份这个行政处罚预先通知书。那么阿里巴巴接到这个通知书之后，他只有3天的时间去决定是否 申请召开这个听证会，它只有3天的时间。那么我们可能会认为这3天的时间太短了，但这个并不是说中国反垄断执法的问题，这个是我们的行政处罚法的法律的规定。那么你要改变这个时间限制，你只能先去修订这个中国的这个行政处罚法。那么当然这边这个两国之间，所以我觉得在这个执法程序上会有很大的一个区别。所以来讲，其实我想从4个角度，刚刚谈完这个我对这个中美差异看法之后，我想总结一下，就是说，其实最大的这个区别在于，第一，虽然政治对反垄断监管都有很密切的很大的影响，但是相对于美国来讲，在中国我们的政治对于反垄断监管的影响可能更为直接一些，它可能程度会更大一些。那么第二点，中美两国它在反垄断的这个实体法上面其实没有任何的差异，差异在于这个执法程序。那么这个是由这个两国这个在我们说更大这个更全面的这个程序法的区别所造成的。对，大概是这些。好，谢谢。
Good. Let me just intervene here to say, particularly for the English speakers, can you speak a little more slowly? Try to pause at the end of your sentence so that the translators can have time to properly convert your speech into Chinese language. That would go for the Chinese speakers too, but mostly the other way around is posing a bit of a problem. Okay, so let's move on to Xingdong Fang. The topic is the contrast between the two systems, the differences and the similarities. I was really particularly impressed by Jet's notification of how rapidly the Chinese system works. I was really amazed that, the US is so legalistic, it drags on for many years, but Alibaba was suddenly given a fine and had huge fine and 3 days to respond. Anyway, Xingdong, your turn.
对，我刚才我觉得可能跟邓老师一样，我觉得应该把欧洲也应该放进来进行比较，是吧？我觉得这次反垄断，我觉得不管是美国、中国、欧洲，我觉得这个共同之处，大家都还是就是说它的驱动力还是自己各自的这个内在的需求啊，还不是外部的这个压力，都是各自的矛盾积累到这个一定的程度，所以我觉得而且都不仅仅是经济问题。同时更是这个政治问题，也不仅仅是这个利益问题，也还涉及到这个权利问题也不仅仅涉及到这个法律问题，还涉及到整个社会的这个发展问题所以我觉得这三个区域，我觉得这是他们的共同之处但是我觉得就是确实从这个政策法律我觉得可能同之处也是很明显因为中国在互联网反垄断呢，我觉得它毕竟是个新手。我觉得就是我个人觉得，我觉得中国目前我们的制度确实就是我觉得不管是反垄断法也好，反不正当竞争法也好，相关的制度应该是我们已经比较完备了。但是在互联网反垄断里头，也是从10年来几乎一事无成现在才开始就是快速的这个推进。所以我觉得中国的互联网反垄断还是处在一个怎么样把这个法律能够有效的这个使用起来。那么美国，我觉得从我们的观察来看，美国就是包括这个丽娜汉和这个蒂姆吴上来以后，我觉得美国可能就是说反垄断的整个理论基础开始发生了很大变化，从原来经济学的这个思维可能转向了一个更加广泛的这个法律的思维。但是我觉得可能目前来说，我觉得可能中美可能还得抄在反垄断方面还得抄这个欧洲的作业我觉得因为我觉得欧洲在这个数字市场法出来以后。我觉得就是代表着，我觉得整个这个数字平台的这个反垄断，整个技术的这个重构它就不再以简单的相关市场或者原来的这个一些经济学的一些指标来衡量就主要是以这个用户的数量超过欧盟10%我觉得都用比较综合的指标来评价一个平台来进行通过这个守门人制度来事前的这个规制。我觉得这个是真正解决数字平台这个治理的这个根本所在。所以我觉得从这个角度来说，我觉得中美 我觉得可能就是还是要还是会在制度建设方面肯定会这个还要跟欧洲学习，是吧？但中国呢，确实就是反垄断这块，就是说我们是个新手，是吧？所以我们没有什么包袱，是吧？这个我们转变就调整也快。然后还可以结合中国的这个行政的这个一些手段，比如说约谈啊，就是很多手段。我觉得这个对见效，这个效果会很快。因为我觉得目前来说，实际上反垄断的互联网的垄断行为，就是说没有什么很难的这个难度很深的问题。比如说这个10年前的这个3颗大战的2选1也好，这个阿里巴巴的这个2选1也好，都是很简单的。如果只要执法者他钱来进行规制，这个不管是用反不正当竞争也好，用反垄断法也好，我觉得就现有的这些法律都是够用的，是吧？这个，但是我觉得就确实就是像数字市场法这种制度的整体的这种重构，可能是未来这个关键所在。大概是这些。
Okay, thank you, Xingdong Fang. Now we'll turn to Neil Chilson.
Thanks, and I'll try my best to speak slowly, although it is against my nature. So a large part of what I know about the Chinese approach to antitrust, I've learned from this conference. So I will not do a contrast and compare so much as lay out some of the characteristics of US antitrust law that may be different, although I'm not confident in that, and I would like to learn more from you all about that. So I think, as the previous speaker alluded to, U.S. antitrust law is pretty old. The U.S. started antitrust law more than 100 years ago. And if you look at the statutes, the laws that were passed at that time, they are quite vague. And that means that much of the what we call antitrust law today is court-made law from bringing cases against companies over time. So it's an evolutionary framework driven by specific cases applying the law to facts. And what that has meant is that in the US, there has been over time an integration of economic principles into that. And there's been an evolution towards what we have today, which is primarily focused on the effects on consumers, the consumer welfare standard, and less focused on what the effects might be on other competitors. That one of the other characteristics, I think, and we've talked a lot around this issue a lot, is that in the US, there's been a concerted effort to keep antitrust law distinct from regulatory approaches. So antitrust law as an enforcement mechanism of a general principle that applies across all industries, and then having separate from antitrust law, a very separate set of agencies at both the state and the federal level that might do industry-specific types of regulation to address concerns. Now, as I think several of the speakers today have mentioned, there is a movement to to change that approach, and so even the House bills that several people have talked about that are in consideration in Congress in the U.S. right now are sort of special antitrust laws aimed at a very specific small set of companies. That hasn't been how the U.S. has traditionally done antitrust law, and it's to be determined whether or not Congress more generally thinks that that's a good idea. I think the political dynamics in the U.S. are very strange right now. I think Paul mentioned that Republicans would want less regulation in this space, but it really depends on which Republicans you talk to. I think maybe we'll get in a little bit into why that is later, what is driving the different approaches here. And I'd love to talk about that because I think a lot about it. But those are some of the key characteristics that I see that are different, or that may be different, given what I know. The older evolutionary nature of law, with a long history of cases behind it in the U.S. And then, one other factor, and I haven't sure that I don't know this about China, but I know it for the US. The US has private lawsuits. So private competitors can bring cases against other companies in court under the antitrust laws. And that has been a big driver of the law as well. It has shaped the analysis that courts apply in this space. So it's not just the government that can bring a case against a company, but companies can bring cases against each other. I will stop there.
Very good, Neil. The very interesting contrast. This sort of the almost common law approach, case law approach versus that. And again, that sort of does explain the difference in speed as well. Now I think we have time now to turn to a more open-ended set of questions, and we have a number of good questions already in the Q&A. Roger Cochetti has a question here, which I'm going to read out, and then anybody can answer it. He's describing the nexus between competition policy and freedom of expression. So in 2017, a unanimous Supreme Court described Facebook as a modern town square. And he asked, does the court's characterization of large platforms as town squares have implications for their treatment in antitrust? Paul has had to take a client call, so he will not be available. But why don't we start with Neil on that one, since it does deal with sort of more the American side.
Certainly. So in that particular case, I think there was this a characterization. I wouldn't even call it a legal characterization, but a sort of description of Facebook as a place where people get together and talk. My sense is that implication, even for the free speech side of things, does not have a lot of weight. I do not think that the Supreme Court is likely to say that that speaking on Facebook is the same as speaking on a piece of government property, for example, or a piece of publicly owned property. In the antitrust space, I think this gets to more of, rather the legal side, this very much gets to the political motivations behind why these cases are coming. So Sarah earlier gave that list of cases. Many of those cases are being brought by Republican AGs who feel like the platforms are biased against their speech on those platforms. And so it is this view of, and I think Adele referenced this too, that the way that the platforms are regulating the uses of those platforms has a public interest flavor to it, and that is what is motivating a lot of the calls, especially from Republicans, to do something about these platforms. So, I think there is a big empirical question whether or not those claims of bias or systematic bias based on viewpoint are happening, but it certainly is the perception, and it is driving a lot of the action, in particular on the right. The thing I'll point out about that on the antitrust, with implications for where the US will go on antitrust, is that is certainly not what is motivating the left of center advocates of antitrust change. Their concerns are more traditional, what I would call progressive concerns about the size of companies and their political influence more generally, rather than concerns about bias. And so you have two different coalitions who have very different objectives that they want out of antitrust reform, somewhat diametrically opposed objectives, actually. And so I think they're both hopeful that if they do reforms, if they can get these through, that their objectives will be met. But I don't see a lot of ground for hopes that both sides will be happy with whatever comes out if something does. So
good. Thank you, Neil. I will take this same question and kind of turn it to the Chinese commentators, Jet and Xingdong. Is freedom of expression or diversity of expression a factor at all in Chinese antitrust or anti-monopoly approaches to the platforms in China?
OK，那我先来说一下吧。这个我先回应一下刚刚这个那个问题了。其实那刚刚提到说在美国，那么除了政府执法，那么也有这个法院的民事诉讼啊，就是这个企业间相互去这个起诉。这个在中国是一样的。在中国除了由政府的行政执法之外，我们也有这个民事诉讼。那么只是说中美两国在具体的这个民事法律诉讼的这个制度上面会有区别。你比如说，在美国是这个3审终审，那么在中国是2审终审。那么在美国对于反垄断的这个赔偿，它有这个3倍的赔偿啊。在中国我没有，我们只能是只能是损害的一个补偿原则，它不能够去有一个惩罚性的3倍赔偿。然后呢，在美国它有这个集团诉讼啊，中国我们没有集团诉讼。那么同时，在美国通常我们可以说原告如果他胜诉了，他可以把他所花的这个律师费，那么可以由被告来承担。但在中国通常我们没有说这种律师费的这个转移的这个承担的制度。然后具体就是说关于这个所谓这个言论自由啊，跟这个平台治理的这个问题。那么我想首先先澄清一点，就是说在中国来讲，这个对于这个平台的它的一个言论的一个管制，它跟反垄断是没有任何关系的。那么反垄断是聚焦于这个竞争法、市场竞争。那么我们说对于这个表达，或者说这个对于言论的这个监管，那么在中国是完全是另外一个这个法律领域才做监管。所以说这两者之间没有任何的关系。那么第二，其实当然我想可能这一点这个方老师可能他应该更权威。反正从我观察来看，这个中国在这个对于平台这个言论这个监管这一块，应该是保持还是保持了相当的这个一致性的啊，跟这个反垄断政策的变化其实不存在这个联系。
我补充点，就是这个就是言论这块，在平台治理这块，我觉得就是来自政府的压力是没有的，是吧？那主要的过去的5到10年里头，主要的这个压力来自于这个平台本身。就是前面我说的，我说在过去的5到10年里头，就中国研究反垄断法相关的这个学者的这个最大的这个课题方面的这个资助者，就是这3个平台啊，每年应该在1000万美金里的这个投入啊，所以基本上在过去这围绕平台的研究，就是基本上都是平台本身都是比较有利的这个学术结论，没有这个是商业影响这个言论啊，这个是在反垄断这个领域里面是非常明显的啊，这个政府在这里头就会有大的这个影响。
So as in the United States, usually it's competitors complaining rather than consumers leading to antitrust action. It's the competitors who feel are being excluded and so on. We have a question from Hu Xiaoyan, and I'm going to let her, she put it in the chat, but I'm going to let her ask it directly.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I was thinking I would just switch to Chinese. This is more addressing to the 2 Chinese panelists here. 就是非常感谢2位，今天觉得也是学到很多。然后我在自己的研究过程，然后包括也是之前和中国反垄断执法者的一个交流过程中，然后就是我觉得对国内的反垄断其实有很多新的理解和期待。然后包括今天这个何教授也说过，其实有一些理论在就是之前的理论也可以用在就是平台反垄断的这个方面。但是我自己有时候就是特别是在对比欧洲跟中国的这个2个案例吧，我觉得就是中国的互联网处在一个跟欧洲相比不太一样的一个政商关系，然后包括我觉得用户对平台的一个理解也跟我在欧洲观察到的不是很一样。所以说我比较好奇的是从监管或者是从执法的角度来讲，就是2位前辈对中国互联网监管理论的创新就是会有哪些预判？就像这个前辈也说过，就是觉得有很多年轻的学者在不断的提出一些新的理解。然后同时也好奇就是我们的监管执法，然后或者说未来的这个立法思路，包括现在正在修订的这个反垄断法，就是会不会跟在欧洲或者是在美国有不同？如果有的话，会是怎样的一个不同？就非常感谢。
行，那是我先说2句吧。其实 这个胡老师，您刚刚提到这个中欧啊，这个它的互联网跟欧洲互联网跟中国的比较，其实我觉得这两者之间，它其实它根本不在一个层级上啊。因为欧洲的互联网平台企业它都太小，对于中国来讲，那其实能跟中国的互联网平台相比较的，可能只有美国的这个可能只有美国的平台了。然后当然说你更为宏大的这么一个问题，那今后在中国的反垄断立法包括执法，那么会是什么样一个走向？我想如果说我们要看将来，我们可以先看过去。那么中国的反垄断法是从1990年代开始酝酿立法，那么从2004年开始正式加速这个立法的这个进程。那么经过4年的酝酿之后，在2007年通过，2008年这个生效。那么到今年是这个第13个年头了。那这里面其实我觉得可以有几点这个启示。那么第一点，那么中国在2004年到2007年这3年立法的过程中，实际上当时我们是非常的开放和谦虚的学习了美国和欧盟的这个法律的。那么我们学习了很多欧美的这个成文法和这个案例法，那么跟欧美的这个法官、政府官员，包括他们的这个专家也做了很多的交流。所以说，那么在2008年生效的这个中国的法律，那么实际上是基本上很大程度上是建构在那么当年我们对于美国和对欧盟它的反垄断法的这个学习的基础之上，那么所建构的。当然说也考虑了中国的一些实际的因素。这个是第一点。第二点，其实我们今天讨论的这个是这个平台的治理，但是我想所有人都看到一个客观的事实是，我们的中国的法律从2008年8月1号生效，那么到现在13年，但是到去年2020年是12年，在2008年到2020年期间，这12年，我们没有对一起互联网行业发起过反垄断调查，也没有对任何一个平台做过处罚。但与此同时，我们在其他的传统行业，在电信，那么在化工，那么在这个医药，在汽车有很多的执法。那么这个我想这个在整整12年的一个互联网这个监管的这个空白，那么这个其实是我想是所有人都无法否认的一个事实。那么这里面会有很多的复杂的因素。当然，其实那么从去年年底开始，那么中美两国都开始加大那么对反垄断的这么一个调查的力度。我们看到，先是由这个对阿里巴巴那么超过180亿人民币的一个处罚，那么现在又有对其他多家互联网企业，其实也都在这个调查过程之中。我们有这个今年我们会修订反垄断法，里面会有条文，那么涉及到对于互联网反垄断的一些描述。我们也通过了这个在互联网这个平台规制的这么一个指南。那么这都是新的立法。如果说就是说你去展望将来的话，那么我想还是在实体法上，就是说在这个法律的这个规则，那么会跟这个美国其实是相对是其实会比较接近。因为我想，那么什么这包括从这个相关市场的这个界定，那么从垄断行为的这个认定，从市场力量的这么一个认定，包括对于这个市场竞争损害效果的一个认定，对于消费者利益的影响，这些基本的这个技术点其实不可能存在差异。在这个技术上面都是趋于一致的。它的差异只会说，我觉得还是这个2点。第一点就是说，虽然中美两国政治对于反垄断都有很大的影响力，但是在中国的影响可能会更加直接一些，因为这是两国的这个政治体制差异所造成的。第二点，那么我们美国和中国，我们的这个在执法的程序上，那么是有很大的差异的。这个执法程序包括说我们说通常我们理解的这个法律的程序，也包括这个执法的机构，也包括我们说所有执法核心一定是执法的人员的这个人员数量的配置，它的一个专业的程度那么都会因此会产生一些差异的。对，谢谢。这个是我的一些观察了。
我就补充邓老师几句吧，就是觉得实际上现在我觉得理论也好，这个制度也好，我觉得我们跟欧美基本上是跟欧美学习，而且基本上是同步的，我觉得没有太多差异。你不管是双边市场什么这些基本的术语，我觉得都会。主要的这个差异我觉得还是在这个执法的这个意愿上过去这个10多年，他为什么这个 作为，是吧？那主要是这个意愿方面。但是我印象很深刻的就是欧洲这个反垄断女皇这个维斯塔格是吧？我觉得他回答我觉得非常好。他说我又不是学者啊，这个学者可以围绕一个这个相关市场可以永远研究下去是吧？但是我是一个执法者啊，当有这个损害发生的时候，那我必须得制止他这个恢复这个市场。所以，但是呢，我觉得这就是我觉得就执法者的这个水平啊，那可能是我们中国还是需要比较大的提升啊。但是我觉得中国也会学得比较快啊，比如说这个欧洲的诉讼市场法是吧？我相信就是这个法律可能在美国要学起来可能会比较慢，但是我觉得中国版的这个诉讼市场法，我觉得很可能会走在这个美国前面。所以我觉得中国就一旦动起来，这个还是会创新速度还是会比较快的。
非常感谢。
So Yin Huang asked a question in the chat some time ago. Did you want to ask that question directly, Yin, or do you want me to summarize it for you? I will summarize it. Basically, she's asking, how can we measure platform power or platform monopoly? How does platform power work? And who has the most platform power, states or companies? This is kind of an international relations question. Is platform power soft power or hard power?
OK， 那其实我先谈一下吧，就是其实现在这个平台，当然说我们说它其实对吧，它很强大。那么它的强大呢，我们其实观察角度，我想其实不仅是在于它的这个资金的实力，也不仅在于是说它的技术的这个先进程度。我想也在于就是说，他掌握很多的这个数据，海量的数据，然后他能够去做跨行业的一个发展。那么以他的这个，他能够去从事多个行业。那么他的这些特点呢，其实使得这些平台有点类似于当年的这个金融行业。我们知道金融行业，它以这个金钱。那么作为它掌握的一个要素，所以它能够跨越很多行业，那么去做发展，那么以此作为它的一个这个杠杆 leverage， 那么去对它不仅是对于市场，那么对于我们个人的生活甚至对于政府行为，那么都会有甚至然后对媒体、对舆论，那么都会产生影响。那么它这种影响力就是我觉得是可以类比于当年的一些这个那么金融平台、金融巨头，它的一种这种影响力。它的这种影响力，我觉得毫无疑问，一方面其实对我们个人生活的这个安宁一定会产生影响，会影响到大家都觉得自己的一个生活的一个自由的程度。那么另一方面，它其实也对各国政府，我想包括中美政府在内，各国政府这个对于市场、对于社会、对于国家的管控，对于国家的治理，也会产生某种程度的这么一种威胁的。对，所以想看听听其他嘉宾在这一块的见解。
Maybe we can also invite like Professor He Qing. Do you want to give any comment on that? 何琴老师，您有什么话要说吗？
不好意思，因为我刚才稍微离开了一下，可以请问一下具体是就哪个问题？
就说讲平台的影响力到底在哪里？就是为什么平台有这个？
好的，好，那么我觉得首先前面像胡教授有提到的这个平台是一个生态圈的问题，这个我印象深刻，那我也是很赞同的。那么平台的影响力，尤其是在数字经济领域，那我觉得可能就是因为他提到的这个为什么要去适用，包括刚才邓律师提到的要去适用这种 leverage。包括在其他行业也有这个 leverage 问题，我是很赞同的，所以可能我没有什么新的观点去补充，那么我也是去进一步这个复议吧，对，就是我赞同就是有存在这种 leverage 的问题，那么这样的这个问题的话，可以用来解释现在数字经济领域的这个市场力量的来源问题。好，大概是想到这些，谢谢。
Neil, did you have anything to say about the market power measurement, the question of power?
Sure. So I think the questioner used the word power a lot, and I find that word to be somewhat imprecise. So you always put something else in front of it. Almost always, you say something like market power, and And there, I think we have lots of economic tools that would seek to define, first of all, define the market. And I talked a little bit about that before, and then estimate the role or the influence that the company has over that market. And typically that's through, we might look at market share, we might look at pricing power, the ability of them to move prices. For these types of digital platforms, I think often we think about, we might label them, we might think that those tools don't work because their users are often not charged a fee. But they still have customers, especially on the advertising side, where we could use those traditional tools to see if they are able to acquire monopoly rents using traditional economic analysis. So that might be one way to look at it. One of the important things I think in U.S. antitrust law is the focus on, when we talk about power, we often describe it as the state having the only legitimate monopoly on force, for example. So that's the strongest monopoly in the U.S. is the state's monopoly on force, on legitimate force. And so it's really important in the antitrust sphere, because it's such a powerful tool, to make sure that use of power is constrained by principle, and that it has specific outcomes, that it's aligned with the interests of users and customers. And the US has not always had a great track record on this. As I mentioned, the laws themselves are vague. And in the past, in the 60s and 70s in particular, were frequently used for political reasons. There's a interesting story about Lyndon Johnson, for example, holding up a merger between two banks because one of the bank presidents was also the editor of the Houston Chronicle, which was heavily critical of Johnson's administration. And once that editor agreed to be less critical in his news coverage, suddenly the bank transaction went through. Richard Nixon also did similar things where he threatened antitrust lawsuits against the major broadcast companies in the US, in order to get positive coverage of his administration, including, I believe there's a story of getting one of them to cover his daughter's wedding. So the US, because of its slow history of moving towards a focus on consumers rather than on conflicting and vague provisions around protecting competitors or stopping contracts in commerce, had some of those abuses. And one of the fights currently is over whether relaxing some of those constraints, what we call the consumer welfare standard, could bring back those types of political abuses of antitrust law. So that's a long-winded and very maybe tangential answer to the question, but I think power is an important question in the antitrust space, both on the company's side, but also on the government side.
No, I think it's very important to bring up the debate within the United States about the consumer welfare standard. I don't know if Chinese experts are familiar with that, but the debate is between people who say you use traditional kind of neoclassical measures of consumer benefit before you mess with industry structure. And the opponents are saying, well, we're talking about maybe different kinds of power, the more social kinds of power or speech kinds of power that Xiaoyan was talking about. In that regard, I have a comment of my own about the nature of competition, and it also relates to the paper we heard about the Apple App Store, right? So this is a good example. It also relates to the question that Brendan Curvis asked in the chat. So there was a trade-off between sort of security and privacy and these gatekeepers, the platforms exercise. So Apple, as a matter of defending its gatekeeping role for apps, which definitely gives it market power, is also saying, well, we're going through these apps and we are deciding whether they are secure or not, or whether they abuse customers or not, or whether they're fraudulent or not. And most consumers would like to have this function done for them, but it also constrains the number of players in the app market, and can also be used by governments to tell Apple, well, take something out of the App Store. So there's a trade-off there between a security, privacy, gatekeeping function and more robust and easy entry of competitor.
Can I ask a question? Because I raised a hand. My question actually is for the Chinese speaker. Because actually my observation is that I think both Denton and Dr. Fang already mentioned, and China's law, antitrust law is more and more, even in the end, maybe it's more similar to American one, even we learn from the European Commission's, European Commission competition law. But my question is, if you look at the other law, like data protection law, privacy law, actually we're all learning or copying from the either Europe or China or American side. My question is why we do that, I mean, from the very beginning, why we start to imitate law either from Europe or China or America, and where is the Chinese input in that? So this is just a simple question. The common practice for me, I observed over years, is that no matter it's privacy law, data protection, or the other law, they all import from other jurisdictions.
OK， 那个，其实我想啊，这个不能简单的讲说，这个中国就是在抄袭或者复制这个美国跟欧洲的法律了。这种说法，当然它一定是错误的，因为在他们这个差异还是很大的。我想首先大的前提就是说，那其实在100年前，那么在中国，我们在开始进入这个在有革命推翻了这个之前的这个帝国的时候，我们那个时候引入的，包括我们的这个经济制度，包括我们的法律体系，其实都无法从之前的这个传统中能够继承太多。所以我们在大的框架上面，那么都是从这个西方去做这个学习。但是并不是说是说一个100%的这么一个继承的。这里面我们会根据中国的这个政治的这个体制，根据我们这个经济的状况，当然也会根据这个我们的这个传统，包括社会文化，会做大量的调整，也会有很多的这个创新。比如说这个反垄断法，一个最简单的例子就是你能看到，如果我们去读中国的反垄断法，拿它去跟美国的法律和欧盟的法律做比较，你发现最大的不同就是中国我们有一个第5章节，叫第5章，叫做这个它实际上是专门是规制这个行政垄断的，就是禁止政府机关滥用行政权力去干预和排除市场竞争，这样的这个条款，那么在美国的法院是没有的，在欧盟的监管法院也是没有的。我们有这么一个专门有这么一个章节去做这么个做对于这个行政垄断一个规定。那正是因为我们的立法者包括执法者，我们看到，那么在中国来讲，其实除了大的这个企业、大的平台会对市场的自由竞争产生威胁之外，那么同样我们的这个政府的机关也可能会在滥用它的行政权力，那么会对这个会对市场竞争会起到干扰。那么所以我们有这么一个特殊的规定。那么具体其实到这个平台的治理，到这个互联网这块的这个治理这块，那么也当然会有这个不一样的地方。比如说我刚才也提到这个中国的这个程序法，那么跟美国是存在极大的差异的。这种差异那么其实是它的背后，那么是整个我们说在这个行政调查、行政处罚这个制度上这个差异。所以我想这样子来讲，我这样讲可能会更加全面一些的。 应该是避免，我觉得避免产生一些误会吧。
谢谢 Jay。
对，就是说，因为互联网这个领域里头，不管是技术也好，商业模式也好，那过去我们这个20-30年，那基本上是跟着美国学的啊，欧洲基本上没有进入到我们的视野，但是现在情况也开始发生变化了。但是像比如说像这次的个人信息保护法，那我觉得我们基本上还是很大程度上参考了欧洲的这个 GDPR 啊，包括就是在新加的这个就是这个类似守门人的这个条款是吧，也是参照了这个欧盟的这个数字市场法啊，所以我个人觉得，我觉得未来，我觉得中国在技术创新方面，我觉得会就是学习欧洲，我觉得会越来越。
I think there's other questions from Xiao Junyang. Do you want to speak out your question? 你可以自己讲一下你的问题吗？杨小军。
I have one question for the Chinese speakers. But my question is there something that what decides that the government, the state wants to use this law against the platforms? Like why the governments use the law to get against with Alibaba in this year? Because as one expert has said that for 12 years, the antitrust law in the digital economy phase has not been used. But why? But in this period of this time, it has been used, and Alibaba has been fined for 18 billion Chinese yuan. I'm wondering whether it has the power to say no to this finding. And also as I read in the news report that the reason for this finding is that Alibaba Group has been using some tools, some ways to gain some advantages in the market stage from 2015. But why is fined now, not before? Thank you. What is behind it? It's the market reason or political reason or something else?
OK， 那个其实当然我想我应该听懂你的问题啊。到想其实如果是说有咱们中国的这个听众，您问中文也可以的。关于这个调查跟处罚，比如阿里巴巴这个时间点啊，对于这个 timing 的这个问题，其实有很多的猜测啊。这种猜测可能更多的是来自于国际上，好像总觉得这里边会有什么有什么阴谋，对吧？是有什么政治这个力量在起作用的。其实从我的角度来看，那么对这么重大的一个案件，它的调查包括处罚，后面都会有很复杂的背景和因素。那么并不是说可能某一个因素或者单某一个因素它起了所谓关键性的作用。同样的例子其实也适用在国际上。你比如说谷歌，对吧？在欧盟，那么从2017、2018、2019连续3年被欧盟委员会因为垄断行为，那么连续处罚了3次。他处罚的这个金额加起来，那么比阿里巴巴这个处罚金额要远远要高得多。那么谷歌它这种这个垄断行为，难道只存在欧洲吗？在美国就没有吗？那么为什么美国的这个 DOJ 和 FTC 没有去处罚谷歌，没有去做出这个可能也是几百亿个处罚的？这里面其实我想这个里面有很多有关于这种政治有关于这个执法机构，有关于我们这个人员配置，也有这个可能调查的这个在技术层面，我们调查这个取证包括有关这个论证各个方面的因素所起的这个，它应该是一个综合作用的一个结果。那么我想这个那至少其实从我的角度来看，我其实并没有说看到就是说这里面有什么所谓的这个可能是一些比较其实大家都比较喜欢，对吧？这个所谓的这个政治阴谋论在后面。因为我们去看这个阿里巴巴这个案子，它的这个处罚的这个决定，我们去读它这个 decision， 那么很清晰。那么从它的这个相关市场的这个界定，那么从它市场力量的这个认定，从它2选1这个滥用行为的这么一个认定，从它这种2选1行为，那么对于市场竞争，那么对于消费者的这个损害和影响，它的整个的论述从法律要件来讲是非常完备的。 那么这个决定书所列举的这个证据，那么也是很清楚的。那么从法律角度讲，其实并没有看到说有这种明显的这个所谓的瑕疵。那么阿里巴巴能否对这个处罚决定能否去给它进行挑战？当然可以。那根据这个中国法律规定，它完全可以去在法院那么提起这个行政诉讼，去挑战这个执法机构的这么一个处罚。那至于说他为什么没有提起处罚，提出这个挑战，那我想这里面可能会有他企业在考虑他的市场发展和他的商业决策他的一些考虑。对，这个是我的一些观察了。
方老师有什么评价吗？
对，我觉得然后阿里这个事情，我觉得确实应该用阴谋论来，我觉得它还是一个水到渠成。我觉得它主要是矛盾积累到一定程度，它一定会爆发啊，因为实际上在过去5年来，实际上不仅仅是没有就说这个没有监管部门出手啊，然后实际上过去5年来，你看也没有真正有学者在这个围绕反垄断能够发出比较大的声音。甚至说媒体是吧？这个大概是很多年前，大概比如央媒时代还会批评这个百度啊什么的。在过去5年呢，就是说连央媒都不批评了。所以我觉得主要是这几个平台，就它在媒体的控制力、学术界的控制力、监管部门的这种这个捕获能力，我觉得实际上是超乎这个是在欧美是不可想象的。就是这个，因为你看就是我自己深有感触，在17年的时候，我就因为发表了那个2选1的这个反垄断的这个报告啊，1天之内2万个公号就是发文这个攻击我。这种这个在中国反垄断就是这个之前这个反垄断的这个代价，这个是非常这个困难的。但是我觉得这种局面它不可持续的，它总有一天它爆发。所以我觉得没有马云那个讲话，它也会有别的事情，就是在这个时间点上就是引爆这个反垄断的这个浪潮，我觉得能够慢慢进入到一个比较正常化的一个状态啊。所以我觉得这一次的这个反垄断，我觉得是因为原来过去5年是不太正常的一个状态的一个爆发而已。
Okay, so we are going to have to close down now. I think there is a very interesting exchange of views here. It's very detailed and a lot to gather here. This session will be recorded, so it will be available for people to watch. I really appreciate the Jet Deng and Fang Xingdong for staying up so late. It must be very late there. And I know that last night when we stayed up, it was hard. So you guys have been very clear in your speaking and analysis, despite how late it is. And so we're not going to carry this on, even though we could talk about some of these issues for a longer period of time. So there will be two more papers on the antitrust competition policy issues tomorrow morning for you in China, tonight for us. So I hope that you can come and maybe comment on those. But for now, I think we'll take our break.
我是中文吧，就是非常感谢，就是各位专家学者来参加，然后这个讨论是非常有意义，而且我觉得也是澄清了很多大家的一些疑问，或者是一些谣言吧，或者是传闻吧 ，speculation 吧，一些猜测，所以我们能够回到一个学理层面去讨论它，我觉得是非常有意义的。谢谢大家。
All right. Good night, and we'll see you later.